So, what is it like in Cardiff? It's not great, actually. Jimmy is based on a case history that a detective chief superintendent from Glasgow told me about. This man, John Cardiff, a remarkable cop, he was asked, would he like another 100 officers on the beat? And he said, no, I prefer 100 health visitors. He was in charge of homicide, but he said, to prevent homicide, I don't need more policemen, I need more health visitors to invest in early child development to prevent homicide. So Gini was based on Carnahan's case history of him, a single mother, a succession of partners, each of whom abused Jimmy physically, if not sexually. As soon as he was old enough, he was labelled with behaviour problems when he went to school, involved in delinquency, known to the police, gangs and violence. He never had a proper job. Any money he gets goes into drink and drugs. His diet, if you could call it that, hot food, fast food, alcohol. And this man had a life expectancy of 54. Now, can you imagine if you're the sort of person who thinks that people's ill health is their own fault? We all have to take responsibility for our own health. Could you imagine if you went to Jimmy and said, I wish I could do a Glaswegian accent, put your socks up. Put your socks up, take a grip, start having salads and wholemeal bread, and stop doing the drugs and alcohol and smoking. Now, you really need a Glaswegian accent to say what Jimmy would say to you. The second word would be off. You get nowhere. That's ridiculous. And that's ignoring the imprint on Jimmy of his tragic history. As I write in my book, give Jimmy good early child development, give him a good education, a stable set of conditions, and then if Jimmy chooses to sit under the Glasgow equivalent of the yum-yum tree, that's up to Jimmy. Then he took decisions, and if he goes hang gliding off a high-rise building and something happens, well, that was his responsibility. But not when he's had this disastrous family history, say it's his fault. And his life expectancy, unlike Baltimore, was 8 years shorter than the Indian average. And we see the imprint of early child development much more generally. Jimmy's a case history. What this shows is cognitive development, measured by IQ, but it's cognitive development in children followed from 22 months of age to 10 years of age. Let's look at the children who at 22 months were in the 10th centile. If they grew up in families of low socioeconomic status, they remain low. There's regression to the mean that need not detain us. If they grow up in families of high socioeconomic status, they catch up. Look at the children who at 22 months of age were in the 90th centile. If they grow up in families of high socioeconomic status, they remain high. Grow up in families of low socioeconomic status, it declines. Assume for the moment that the differences at 22 months were all biological, genes, nutrition, things of that nature. And the differences associated with the socioeconomic status of the family were social. The social trumps the biological. We need to make a difference early in life, and we can. We've been monitoring the proportion of children age 5 who have a good level of development, ready for school, by local authority in England. And we're urging our colleagues in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland to do something similar. Local authority, index of multiple deprivation, the most affluent and the most deprived, and you can see this relationship. One strategy to improve early child development is to reduce poverty and deprivation. Move these local authorities up towards the middle, and early child development would improve. But there's a lot of scatter around the line. For a given level of deprivation, some areas are doing better than others. A second strategy is to support parents. I've got an idea. How about 1,000 days program where you would follow all children and make sure all children for the first 2 years of life with 99.9% coverage? I wish I'd had that idea. I learned about it this afternoon from Ruth Hussey. But it's vitally important. So we may not be able to change deprivation overnight, but we can support families to break the link between deprivation. Oh, the other thing about this is for England, the average was about 59%. Only 59% of children were classified as having a good level of development age 5. In the subsequent monitoring, it had gone down to 52%, but they changed the measurement. They changed the measurement, then it went back up again, but it's under 60%. What? What? Fewer than 60% of children in England have a good level of development age 5. How can that possibly be? This is a brainy country. And the children seem to be doing very badly. Maybe it's an artifact. Well, actually, it isn't. This is from UNICEF data for the rich countries. Country comparison on average rank in 4 dimensions of child well-being: material, health, education, and behaviors and risks in the early 2000s and the late 2000s. Well, we've come up from being equal bottom rank with the US to pretty close to the bottom. Did I mention that the US ranked 50th in the probability of a 15-year-old dying before the age of 60? I wonder, could it be linked to poor or quality early child development? Perhaps it could. So we're not doing very well. And I said one way of dealing with the link between deprivation and early child development is improving support for families, but another way is reduced poverty. Here, in this comparison, poverty is defined as less than 60% median income. Poverty soon won't be a problem anymore, at least in England, because the government is going to drop it. So they'll abolish it, and it's much easier than redistribution. But before that goes, we can see the effect of redistribution through taxes and transfers, social transfers. So compare Latvia and Sweden. Before taxes and transfers, child poverty in Latvia is about 35%. In Sweden, it's 32%. After taxes and transfers, child poverty in Latvia is 25%. In Sweden, it's about 12%. In Slovenia, it's even lower. The US is worse than Latvia. They've decided they're very tolerant of high levels of child poverty. Do you hear in the debates, in the primaries, do you hear child poverty? We've got to get rid of child poverty. Maybe Bernie Sanders is saying something about that. Is it Ted Cruz or Donald Trump or Marco Rubio? Or who's talking about getting rid of child poverty? Using the fiscal system to reduce child poverty. And we, in the United Kingdom, look more like Latvia than we do like Slovenia. We've decided we're tolerant of child poverty, and that's damaging childhood. And that will make health inequalities worse, other things being equal. And we could do something about it, other than change the definition of child poverty. And this makes a difference. Look at these Latin American countries. This plots the percent of children aged 3 to 5 enrolled in preschool education. That's the solid line. So Cuba, Costa Rica, Chile, very high. And the percent of children who have level 4 reading scores, high level of reading scores, in the 6th grade. Cuba, Costa Rica, and Chile are high. The higher, in general, the level of enrollment in preschool, the better the reading scores. Paraguay, Dominican Republic, and Colombia, Peru, are down here. What a coincidence. Cuba, Costa Rica, and Chile have the longest life expectancy of these countries. And Paraguay, Dominican Republic, and Colombia have the shortest. It's consistent with saying a life course approach applies. Enrollment in preschool, better performance in school, better conditions in adulthood, longer life expectancy. We can make a difference. I should distribute a questionnaire and ask, does anybody know what intergenerational earnings elasticity is? And if so, answers on a postcard. I may have to explain this. The Gini coefficient, as you probably know, is a measure of income inequality. This ridiculous thing measures the correlation between the income of adults and the income of their adult children. So if the income of children exactly resembles the income of their parents, a country will score 1 on this metric. If there's no relation between the income of parents and the income of their children, a country would score 0. So in Finland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, there's very little relation between the income of parents and the income of their adult children. It means there's a lot of social mobility. The US and the UK, there's a high correlation between income of parents and income of their adult children. It means there's much less social mobility. And that's correlated with the Gini coefficient, the measure of income inequality. In other words, let me translate that into English. The greater the distance between the rungs of the ladder, the more difficult it is to get from one rung to the next. For the next generation is likely to be consigned to the same socioeconomic position their parents were in. Too much income inequality tilts the playing field. It's all very well to talk about aspiration and opportunity, but we haven't got that. We don't have the possibility. We need a less unequal society, like these Marxist-Leninists, whatever it is, Finland. By the way, their GDP and their private sectors are a good deal better than ours. So I'm not quite sure about that. Maximizing capabilities and control. Another word for that is education. Infant mortality by mother's education in all of these countries. Secondary or higher education, no education. In all of these countries, from Mozambique, Chad, Guinea to Colombia, the more education a mother has, the lower the infant mortality. What you actually see here is the variation between the countries is less for women with secondary education. If you live in a poor country with high average infant mortality, but you've got more education, your children are more likely to survive. So education, as I showed you in the US, is good for your own health. Education of women is good for children's health. The number one cause of the decline in infant and child mortality globally is education of women. Not high-tech interventions, not even immunization, important as that is. It's education of women. The key to empowerment of women is education. It's good for their health. It's good for their children's health. And will we be drowning in babies? No, we won't. Because the more education a woman has, the fewer babies she has. Because she can make the choice. She's educated. Do I want to have children? And if so, when? And how many? And all of those things. And when you get involved in global health, the first message is to be culturally sensitive. They do things differently in that country over there. Here, surely, is an example where human rights trumps cultural sensitivity. The right of a woman to be treated like a human being surely is more important than cultural sensitivity. And you can see that because the more education a woman has, the less likely is she to endorse that ghastly proposition. So, better health for her children, control over reproduction and control over her body. Education can do all of that. Fair employment and good work. One of the things we want work to do is to get people out of poverty. These are Joseph Rowntree figures looking at the UK and people who are below the minimum income threshold, families of working age where at least one adult is working, or workless families. There are more households in poverty where at least one adult is working than there are workless households. And in those households where at least one adult is working, 3/4 of the adults are working. They are in poverty, not because they're feckless, not because they're shirkers, not because they're welfare queens. It's because they're lowly paid. So we want work to be a mechanism to get people out of poverty. And it's not working very well. Which relates to ensure a healthy standard of living. I say shocking news. Welfare spending improves health and reduces health inequality. Comparing, our colleague Ollie Lundberg compared countries across Europe and looked at net total social expenditure as percent of GDP or in purchasing power parities, and the odds of poor health, inequalities in health by education. The more generous a country's social expenditure, the narrower the gap in health between those with primary education and those with tertiary education. A more generous social expenditure is related to a flatter gradient in health, a narrower gap, and better overall health. Whoever spread the rumor that there's something bad about welfare spending? These days, all a politician has to say is, welfare. Oh yeah, we've got to get the welfare bill done. Why? To make people's health worse? To increase health inequalities? Is that why we have to get the welfare bill done? Well, our welfare bill is unsustainable. I'm not a politician, by the way. I have no party political preferences. You believe that? You believe in it? At least not in public do I have public political preferences. I go with the data and the evidence. So I don't think income inequality is a great thing, and it has been increasing in all these countries. Belgium, Netherlands and France, little change, Greece and Turkey. These are OECD countries. So it's not great. And somebody earlier today quoted the Oxfam report of 62 billionaires have the same combined wealth of half the global population. And that figure's been coming down. It was 80, and it was 100 and something, and it was more. So we're getting increasing concentrations of income and wealth. And that's not very good. Those rich people don't need all that money. Poor guys. I mean, what, you know, I've written about this in the Health Gap. The top 25 hedge fund managers in New York had a combined income of between $23 billion and $28 billion. That's the same as the 48 million people of Tanzania. So notionally, if those hedge fund managers went without their income for 1 year, well, what difference does it make? You're going to make $1 billion the next year. And you made $1 billion the year before. How many yachts can you buy? And if they fall, can you forewent? Anyway, if they were induced to forego that income for 1 year, that would double the per capita income of Tanzania. And I'm not suggesting we simply give it to Tanzanians, but could you imagine the schools you could build, and the clean water you could pipe, and the nurses you could employ? This is not a good arrangement, and I think it's a very unstable arrangement. This is a rant, in case I have been ranting. I'm going to rant. I live a very sheltered life, and it's come to my attention very late in life. Are you ready for this? That some people in public life don't always tell the truth. I know that's shocking, and I'm sorry to have to share that news with you. You know, when the bishop says I didn't do it, and the next day he's gone. The cabinet minister said I didn't ask my wife to take the points of the driving, whatever, and he's gone. And when we're told that our economy is the envy of the world, the envy of the world. This is average real wage index for G20 countries, 2007-13. So 100 is the index for 2007. There's Australia, Canada, Germany, France, the US, 101.4. What? We're the envy of the world. We're doing the worst. Now, you've got to be a nerd to look up the ILO Global Wage Index. But how can we have a sensible public debate when we haven't got the evidence? A functioning democracy, I'm quoting Amartya Sen now, depends on public deliberation. And how can you have public deliberation when you're being misled? What I said to these students, these school students that I talked to last Friday, I did show them this, and some of them I know come from very conservative backgrounds, and some from other, whatever. And I said, this is not about what you or your parents believe is the right government. This is about having an informed public debate. And we can't have an informed public debate if we haven't got the evidence. And I say you've got to be a nerd to look up the ILO Global Wage Database. I mean, to say something that sounds partly political, but you know, we're heading in the UK and England for a one-party state. You know, because we have an incompetent opposition who let the government get away with everything. And you know, I don't care which one's in government or which is on the other side. We need proper, informed debate. That's my rant. Now let me go back to science. Growing old healthily. Life expectancy at age 50. The gaps are bigger always for men than women, interestingly enough. So, looking at 15 European countries, life expectancy at 50 for those with tertiary education, ISC, ED, 5 to 6, tertiary education, and primary education. So there's Sweden, SE, has the longest life expectancy at 50 of any of these countries, and the narrowest gap by education. There's Hungary with the shortest and a big gap. And consistent with what I said when I was talking about the comparison of infant mortality by mother's education, the gap among countries is much less for those with university education than it is for those with primary education. So, message one. There are always socioeconomic differences in countries. You live in a complex society, some people will have more than others for a whole variety of reasons. But the gap in health between those with more and those with less varies. It's quite small in Sweden, in Italy and Norway. And it's quite big in Hungary, Estonia, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, the newer members of the European Union. So message one is the gradient varies. Message two is the variation among countries is much bigger for those with little education. Or another way of saying that, message three, if you're in a country with poor health, you can get much better health by having good education. If you think health is a matter of personal responsibility, how come Americans all suddenly got feckless? If you think obesity is a matter of genes, how come the genome changed so quickly in the United States? And if you think that health is a matter of personal responsibility, how come smoking rates went down when obesity levels came up? It's ridiculous saying it's your fault that you're overweight, when there's this amazing social pattern. You will have the same reaction I had when I saw it. It's hard to keep your mouth closed. It's ghastly. But it means to deal with the obesity problem, we've got to deal with the environment, broadly conceived. The food supply, sugar-sweetened beverages, and the like. And alcohol. I produced this report some time ago when an economist colleague of mine said, I teach this stuff, and I've never seen such a close relation between price and consumption. That's the real price of alcohol, and that's consumption. What a surprise! We're drinking more because it's got cheaper. Raise the price and consumption goes down. That's economics 1, that's not even economics 101. They said my economics colleagues looked at this graph on the cover of my report and he said, I teach this stuff and I've never seen anything quite so clear as that. Ooh, we could have minimum unit pricing. Be a good idea, wouldn't it? I've been citing Pablo Neruda when we started the Global Commission, WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health. We launched it in Santiago de Chile. So I'd cite a Chilean poet and I said, rise up with me against the organization of misery. And I said to my publisher, I wanted to call my book The Organization of Misery. She said, I said, well, can I call it the Organization of Hope? Well, better, but no. So I called the first chapter the Organization of Misery, and document the inequalities in health between countries and within countries. And then I lay out the evidence of what we can do. And I call the last chapter the Organization of Hope, because there are inspiring examples from around the world that we can make a difference. And we are making a difference. I mean, look at this. Where I mentioned we're about to do a review of social determinants and health equity in the Americas. The USA, Cuba, Colombia, Brazil, Peru. The gap in male life expectancy is 66 and 43. That's 23-year gap in male life expectancy in the 1950s. 2005-10, we're talking about 69 to maybe 76, 7-year gap. So we've gone from whatever it was, 23-year gap to a 7-year gap among countries. So the gap between countries is getting much smaller. And there are good examples where the gradient within countries is getting flatter. This is stunting, slow growth in the first year of life by family income in Brazil. So 1974-5, very steep gradient by family income quintile and stunting. 1989, the gradient's getting flatter. 1996, 2006-7. I want to get up here and something cheer, proclaim, hey, we can make a difference. People are making a difference. When we did our European review of social determinants and the health divide, Europe includes the whole of the former Soviet Union, includes Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, I don't know where it's done. And we said, if you're in a country that's taking very little action on social determinants, do something. It'll make a difference. If you're Poland or the Czech Republic and you're doing things, do more. And if you're Sweden and Norway, do it better. Thank you.
Take one or two questions before we ask the minister to say a few words. So is anybody further question you want to ask?
Any question other than, can we hear the minister now, please?
In your book, which I believe is published quite recently, available in most of the bookshops, you tell a story about someone challenging you for one of your reports for only mentioning neoliberalism once, and your response was you apologised and you meant to take out all references to it. You touched on politics a little bit tonight, and there's many ideas and many ways in which ideas become real in the world. The politics and the political process is probably one of the most direct ones. So I wanted to ask you, what should I, as a public health practitioner, what should my relationship, if any, be with politics and the political process?
I'm not good on should, or what your relationship should be. I'm not very good on telling people what they should do. I can tell you what I, as a public health person, do, which is present the evidence in the best way I know how, and try, maybe unsuccessfully, to stay clear of the party political issues in public. It's intensely political. There's no question that it's intensely political. But to try and stay clear of the party political issues in public. But base it on the evidence. I mean, I was giving a lecture to the opening session of the American Public Health Association 2 years ago, and I showed them a version of that graph about childhood poverty, and that the US was doing worse than Latvia. And I said, Republican, Democrat, I couldn't care less. This is our children we're talking about. This is our children. And I said, you live in a democracy. This must be the level of child poverty that you want. Otherwise, you would elect a government that did something different. Now, if you like, that's intensely political, but it's not taking a party political position. It's saying children's health will be damaged unless you do things differently. And I think we should be part of that public discourse. When I had my rant about the lack of open information, we, as public health professionals, what we do in our day job is deal with evidence all day, every day. So we're pretty good at synthesizing evidence, interpreting it, and we should be pretty good at conveying it. So I think, that sounds like I'm saying should, but I think what we have a special place to do is actually present the evidence in the best and most powerful way we know how. If you are inclined in a different way, that's why I say I don't say should. I'm not, but if you're inclined in a different way, you might have a more active role in the political process. You might be an academic who becomes a politician and a minister. And I don't have a moral view about that. I don't say that you should do what the minister did. That was his choice to use his abilities and skills and knowledge to become a minister. That wasn't my choice. That's
The question at the top. David?
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. David Hughes from Learning and Work Institute. Thanks for a great lecture. It's really, really shocking, but it's great to have the evidence back. I really liked your kind of idea about an informed public debate. And I thought your comment about being a nerd for looking up the ILO Global Wage Database was probably a good one. But I also was thinking about some of the stats from some recent reports. So the OECD came out with a report in England that there are 9 million adults with poor literacy and numeracy.
9 million adults.
In England with poor literacy and numeracy. So even if they were nerds, they wouldn't be able to look it up and understand it. So poor literacy meaning you can't understand the instructions on an aspirin bottle.
Yeah.
There are 7 million adults in the UK who've never been online. So even if they were nerds, they wouldn't be able to go and find it because it is online. You know? So there's something about some basic skills and links to health inequalities. And I think the King's Fund did some research about all of the public health work under New Labour in the kind of 2000s over about a decade. And I think they showed that nearly all of the gains around some of the risk factors of bad diet, exercise, alcoholism, drugs, etc. And nearly all of the gains were with people with graduate degrees. And I suppose my question is whether, I don't know whether your book covers it, but it'd be fantastic if you could start to highlight some of those inequalities of basic skills and the public health messages that won't get through to people because they simply don't understand.
Well, I skipped over this because I was worried about time, but these are PISA scores, which, as I'm sure you know, the Programme of International Student Assessment. They measure maths, literacy, and science in young people aged 15. And this is the gradient by the International Social Economic Classification, social status. There's Finland, which always does the best in Europe and has a relatively shallow gradient, has a gradient. But there's the UK, our best is not as good as the best in Finland, and our worst is a good deal worse than the worst in Finland. That's the gradient. And the USA, I always like the US because it makes us look halfway decent. And there's China, there's Macau, a very shallow gradient, and they now beat the Finns. So this is consistent with what you're saying, and it'll be music to your ears. Adult education ought to start with preschool. And we're not doing well. I mean, that figure, that one, we're doing very badly. We should be up here with Finland, Netherlands, Norway. Why aren't we? Why aren't we? That's where we should be. And that's playing out in poor PISA scores. So it's exactly what you're saying. We need a more educated population. And my view about education is not just ability to read the pack on an aspirin, you know, the label on an aspirin pack, health literacy. I'm sure health literacy is important, but it's literacy that's important. And the skills, the life management skills that education gives you, that not just, I mean, you may not look up the ILO database, but you're just better able to frame an argument, to understand an argument, to engage, and to fight your way with the insurance company or whatever it is you have to do to get through this complicated modern life of ours. So, and we're failing very badly. And I talk about Finland in my book because I've been watching these for years. When I went to Finland, I was invited by the Finnish Medical Association. They said, would you like to see a hospital? I said, no, I'd like to see a school. What? So one of the doctors came with me, said he hadn't been inside a school since he did his A-levels. And we went to see a Finnish school. And they're very impressive what they do there. You think about our education policy and then take the opposite. That's what they're doing. No league tables, you know, no naming and shaming, comprehensive education, etc., etc. High pay for teachers, high status for teachers, much valued, real investment in early childhood, high pay for the people who do preschool, etc. I mean, they do all this stuff.